I'm Faith,
And I'm Steve.
and this is your friendly neighborhood home inspector podcast. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing great.
We haven't recorded in a while. Are you ready to get back into it?
Yeah, we've been sort of busy, but I'm glad to get back in the studio.
Well, today we're going to talk about wood rot, the causes, the effects, the identification, the treatment, if treated lumber affects anything, if there's any prevention methods, just all sorts of stuff. You've been doing some reading on this subject. What do you have to tell me today?
Well, I was reading up on some of the causes and prevention, and the reason we're talking about it today is because we recently bought a 1920s house, and through the renovation, found some significant wood rot on one of the windowsills, and so it got me thinking about, how could this have been prevented?
I feel like there's always wood rot on windowsills. Like that seems like the most common place that I hear about. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of areas where the water can get in and seep in, and there's the slope isn't as great as the wall, so the water has a longer retention time. So it has a bigger chance of seeping into the wall right there.
So then you're always telling me that if you're having a two-story home, the upper windows are always a little bit more protected from the soffit. So the downstairs windows on two-story homes are probably the most common, would you say, for wood rot, just from what I've heard?
We were looking specifically at these casement windows, and it's the bottom edge of casement windows take the biggest beating, and it's the bottom story on a two-story house where they're most exposed. And so there's a little section of the window that's not painted from the factory, and then it's sort of tucked away when the window's shut, and so it's just a great little spot to get wood rot going.
Why wouldn't they paint it in the factory? Like, what? It seems like a very easy solution to like help prevention of wood rot.
I don't know why it's not done at the factory. There's actually quite a little debate among home inspectors and window manufacturers and painters on what the best solution is. I think the window manufacturers point at the painters saying that this should be painted on site, and the window painters are painting the exposed surface. So there's two things that go on there. There's the exposed wood that's not protected, and then on top of that, some of these casement windows will have an aluminum sheathing on the outside, and so you have this very small space between the aluminum and the wood, and then you actually get condensation forming from the moisture that's just in the air, and that'll really start the rot on those types of windows.
So windows are made out of treated lumber most of the time.
No. Sometimes the framing around them after a repair might be treated, but it's not treated lumber from the factory, because we only treat lumber if it's in direct contact with the ground or concrete. We also will treat decking wood, which is can be in contact with the ground.
Treated lumber, though, prevents wood rot, doesn't it?
It helps prevent it. There's some woods that are naturally resistant to wood rot, and then we have chemicals that we can add to woods, but that just increases the cost.
That makes sense, but it seems silly to me for things that you're using on the exterior of your home not to have that prevention for wood rot if they're going to be exposed to that risk and that type of deterioration.
It's all comes down to cost. I mean, you would increase the cost of the house if you built the whole thing from treated lumber. I think the best thing to do is take the steps that are necessary to prevent the moisture from being allowed to penetrate in those areas.
What are those steps?
Well, before I get to that, I was doing my reading, getting ready for this, and I read a stat here I thought was pretty telling. It says more than 5% of all the construction lumber manufactured in the U.S. each year is used to replace wood that is decayed in existing structures. This doesn't need to be the case, so we're spending 5% of our produced wood just fixing stuff that we could have stopped.
Now, would it be 5% more expensive to just make the windows out of treated lumber?
Yes, it would have been more than 5%.
Oh,
right?
darn. My solution to all the problems has crumbled in front of me.
Right. Nice try. So what was your previous question? What was the things to prevent it?
Yeah, what are the prevention methods that people can do?
Well, let's go back to the rotting windows. You and I were talking about these casement windows, which are
bane of my existence. Just
right.
Impossible to open. Oh, don't open half the time.
And always rot at the bottom, right? So the one that started this whole little adventure was a standard double hung window, and the window was replaced on my 1920s house, but the window sill was original. And when we found the damage, I could put my hand in the hole up to my wrist. So It was about the size of my hand and about as deep as my hand. So I said, that is pretty significant. And so what it comes down to is preventing the water from entering the system. And when I say system, I mean the window sill or the wall system. And I always thinking of walls as very steep roofs. We always want the water to shed to the next level and then drip off. It's just a maintenance of these systems that will prevent this. So in this case, the caulking wasn't maintained for a little while, and it's a very small little detail that's not even noticeable unless you're looking for it. But the water was allowed to hit the windowsill, and then once it got into the missing caulking, it entered the structure, and now it's behind the painted surface. The food source is the wood, and the temperature is almost always the right temperature for mold unless it's the middle of winter. And so we just added the last ingredient, which is the water. And once we added the water, the decay started and the wood rotted.
I'm thinking of it kind of like a fire. Like with a fire, you have to have the three components: the heat, the fuel, and the oxygen. With wood rot, you have to have the mold, the water, and I also guess oxygen.
Well, you need air, oxygen, the food source, and temperature. So any one of those you remove. So the temperature is correct almost all the time. The food source is your house, and then you have the water. So we can only control the water, and we control the water by allowing things to dry quickly or not penetrate and remain saturated, I guess, to dry quickly again.
So you said the temperature, is it killed off at high temperatures, killed off at low temperatures?
Well, from the readings, it says above 100 degrees, you're not going to have much of a mold issue, and that's probably because it's going to dry out fast enough. I never dealt with mold at all in Arizona. I never had anything turn black and rot away. I just had it dry up and fall apart. And then in the middle of winter, it's 10, 20 degrees. Obviously, there's molds that survive in low temperatures. We have molds in the Arctic. However, we don't have the molds that destroy our houses thriving in the Midwest at cold temperatures. It just waits for spring, summer, and fall, and it does fine.
Got it. So does it go dormant or does it die off in those cold
It goes dormant. So the mold spores are always around us. And once the conditions become adequate, then they just thrive. So that's why you'll come out on a morning in the summertime and all of a sudden see the mushrooms growing out of your yard. Those spores were there all along, and then we got a nice rain, and boom, they just grew the night overnight.
So this is kind of besides the point. With wood rot is caused by water. What is dry rot? Because I'm just curious about that.
It's another type of bacteria or fungus, and it just is. It's not requiring as much moisture to thrive.
But it makes a little that three pillars of the wood rot: the food, the
moisture and temperature, right? And that's my understanding. And dry rot is easy to identify. The structure of the damage will turn the wood into almost cubes, real geometric little square shapes.
Huh. I wonder why.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why it does that.
We'll have to look into that before our episode on dry rot, I guess.
Yes. So you want to talk about how I addressed the damage I found?
How did you fix the problem?
So, in this house, we have 25 windows, and fortunately, all 23 of the 25 windows were in good enough shape that all we had to do is we gave them a good washing, then we applied a caulking in all the open joints, and then we primed the windowsills and painted them. And that's going to give these windows 10 more years of life easily, the windowsills. On the few windows that were damaged beyond that, I removed the very damaged material that it can just crumble. I took a painter's putty knife and in some cases even a chisel and just took off the soft material. Then I took a Minwax wood hardener. It comes in like a quart jar, and you pour it into the wood and you put it coating after coating, following just a few seconds between each one, and that soaks in the wood very, very quickly and makes the wood that remains structurally sound. So it became very hard. Then I was left with this hole that was the size of my hand. So I was going to put in a wood putty, but I didn't want to fill the entire hole with the wood putty because of the cost, and you only want to make it so thick. So I'd have had done 7, 8, 9, 10 coats to get it filled. So I took a piece of scrap hardwood, cut it to approximately fit the hole, fit it in there, screwed it down to the wood beneath so it would be nice and solid. Now all I had to fill was this little 1/4-inch gap, and so I filled that with this wood hardener, which is a 2-part product. Think of it as Bondo for wood. Mm-hmm. Once that hardened, I just could machine that, so I sanded it or used a chisel, made that flat, and then primed it and painted it. And if you were to look at this windowsill now, you wouldn't be able to see where the repair was.
So this was a treatment method. if we're talking about prevention, if you had a person living in the home who was on top of this and preventing it, how long do you think those pieces of wood would last, or do you think it eventually would just have to be replaced?
I think if you properly maintain a home and kept water from intruding in the wall systems, you could expect hundreds of years of service out of the wood. It's always comes down to the maintenance, and it's basically just housekeeping, cleaning, and checking the caulking. It's not a fun thing to do to go around caulking your house, and it's not an easy thing to see where the failures are. So it's usually out of sight, out of mind, and then when you notice it failing catastrophically in one area, you're all of a sudden more attuned to it, and you start looking around. You're like, oh, all my windows are starting to rot away, and then you're looking at a really big expense trying to fix this stuff. So it truly is ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We spent a week caulking, painting, and priming these remaining windows, but that week will probably save us 20 grand in the next 10 years because those windows will all last and not deteriorate.
Nice. How often should people be like thinking they need to be recaulking for their windows and stuff? Is that like a yearly thing? Is it a
You know, it certainly wouldn't hurt to walk around and look every year. Some of these caulks say 25 years on them. Sometimes they say 50 years is how long the caulk will last. I've seen ones that say lifetime. But let's just say 95% of the things you caulked are going to just hold up fine because they're doing their job. But there's 5% where you had a little bit bigger of a gap. You might have had some soil or dirt that prevented the caulk from sealing well, or something mechanically removed it, rubbed against it, or broke it for some other reason. Those are the things you should go back and just clean up and recaulk. So when you caulk the first time and it takes you all weekend, you'll be dreading it the next year, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to spend all weekend caulking again. But that's not really what's going to happen. The next year, you spend half an hour walking around, and you look and you find those, 7 or 8 spots that have a little opening, and you just recaulk those, and that's your maintenance. And if you do that every year, it's a little bit of a drag, but that'll save you so much money in the long term.
that's just awesome that you can it takes some work and it takes a discerning eye, but once you get the hang of like know what you're looking for, I think it'll be easier, wouldn't you say?
I think so, and it's one of those things. You keep your house maintained; it's going to look nicer because you maintained it, but also it's really going to preserve your investment. You can't just sit there and say, well, I'll do this later, I'll do this later. Next thing you know, you're going to have a big rotting mess. It's going to cost a lot more to fix.
Well, is there anything else you want to add before we close out this episode?
No, I hope people sort of put in their mind how important it is to maintain these watertight structures, and I hope they sort of glean some insight on how to fix it if it does get ahead of you.
Okay. So to close out, do you have any fun facts to give me?
Well, I want to go back to that thing that I said in the beginning. 5% of the wood manufactured in the U.S. is to replace damaged wood in homes. And let that soak in for a minute. One way to think about that is 5% of your house every year is rotting away, which is terrifying. But even more dramatic, replacing a single $20 piece of wood is far more expensive than the day you put it in originally because you were building the house. To replace the wood, you've got to spend all the time and effort taking it out, removing the fasteners. Then you've got to paint the new piece, caulk it, put it back in, and the economies of scale of putting one piece of wood in or 2 pieces of wood, it's going to be much more expensive than the day you built the house. So the key to all this is take a little time every year, check where the caulking is, look what's going on with your house, look what's going on around your house, and just keep the thing from rotting away. And it'll last for a very long time if you just maintain it.
Long story short, prevention, prevention, prevention.
Precisely.
I'm Faith.
And I'm Steve.
And this has been your friendly neighborhood home inspector. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been a Murawski Inspections podcast. If you want to know more about our services, visit our website at murawskiinspections.com.